I would like to welcome Char McCargo. This webinar is being presented by the Center for Local History at the Arlington Public Library. We're very pleased to have her with us today. She is the CEO and owner of Finding Things for You, LLC. She's been a genealogist since 1981 and has appeared in numerous television interviews with CBS, Fox, Comcast, public broadcasting services, just to name a few, and some documentaries. She's received numerous awards for her work in genealogy. She was the City of Alexandria's genealogist on the Alexandria Freedmen and Contraband Cemetery. She became a living legend of Alexandria in 2014, and she is the co-author of African Americans of Alexandria, Virginia, Beacons of Light in the 20th Century. Thank you for joining us, Char. We're so pleased to have you today. And if you would like to start sharing your screen, I will mute myself and you can take it away.
Okay, let me end this. Okay, I don't see the icon at the bottom, so share your screen. Let me do this. Okay, I see it now. And PowerPoint is not up yet. Okay. Do you see the PowerPoint?
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't.
Oh, okay. Let me end this. Get up here. Okay, I'm here. Say share my screen, Zoom. Share computer sound. Okay, share.
Okay, we can see your Zoom window. There's the PowerPoint.
Okay, you see it? Okay, thank you. Okay, I want to thank everyone for attending this lecture. Over my years in doing genealogy, I realized that not everyone could start their genealogy from the present and work their way back. For instance, I could not do that on one side of my family. So I kept thinking ways of being able to research. And so for years now, I've been using what I call reverse genealogical research. And I'm going to walk you through a case study that I did for a particular person and being able to reveal who her relatives were. You'll see this is Miss Carolyn McCrae that I just popped in. Now the definition of reverse genealogy, I wanted to put this in so people to make sure that everyone understands what it actually means. What you need to know before you are starting, this is in any genealogical research you're going to do. You must know the history of the area you're researching. You must know the lay of the land. Without that, you're going to have more brick walls as you tend to research. You need to have a map of the research area. For instance, you might have family members who did not get married in their county's courthouse because the county next to them courthouse was closer to them instead of going to the courthouse in their own county. So if you can see the map and locate where they were, and if you cannot find the records in the county they were in, you need to check the county next to them because maybe they went over there and did their business as far as getting married, even filing deeds. We today have to file our deed in the county that we live in. Back in the day, you necessarily didn't have to do that. You can go to the neighboring county and do that. So that's one of the things that you want to make sure you know the history of the area You have a map, so you can actually have a visual of what is going on and who's where, and the different towns, the name of the different areas. Where was the country store? Where was the road? Because like when my people talk, they don't say, "Oh, I went to South Boston," which is a city in Halifax County. They said, "I went to the Kirby store." Well, I don't know what that is. Back in the day, when their families were telling them that, it was a Kirby store. Older maps would show it was a Kirby store. So that's why you need to basically have maps so you can have an idea, and have maps for different periods of time. Have maps during, the time that your family was there. If you're researching them back, you want to have maps of different times so you can see what places were there when they were living there and where your ancestors were living. Identify the records of your research area. Not all counties and states are alike. In the state of Virginia, we are fortunate that our vital statistics go back to 1853 for the state, with some interruptions in the period of time. And our marriages go all the way back to marriage bonds in these late 1600s, 1700s. But other states, some of their vital statistics didn't start until the 20th century. So you need to know what records are available so that you know what you're dealing with. Now, private records, when it comes to vital statistics, could be in the family Bible. And that's something that is privately kept, might have been donated. Unfortunately, some people threw out a lot of documents thinking they're old stuff and threw them out, but they might exist someplace. You want to pay attention to all the surnames in the family and the naming patterns. It's not on this list, but you want to pay attention to that, because from generation to generation, family members would name people after each other every generation. So if you have a family member that has a common last name, a common surname, and it's going to be difficult unless you know how that family went about naming their children. And from generation to generation, maybe they had a pattern where they always had a Sarah, they always had a David, they always had a John. Then when you find someone else with the same surname, but you see the naming pattern, that might be a clue. This is your family and the other family is not. Where do you start? Traditionally, genealogy research starts present and work backwards, but reverse genealogy can start anywhere. You might inherit a photograph, and on the back of the photograph might have the name of that individual, and you have no idea who that person is. You never heard of that person. You can start with just that if you know where your family came from. Two important things in genealogy you need to have: the geographical location and the name. With that, you can make an attempt to start doing the research. Without the geographic location, you don't know where to start. Without the name of the person, you might be able to find something if you know that your family came from this little town, and the picture that you have, if the person lived into the mid 20th century, you might be able to go to that community that your family came out of and ask anybody, do you recognize this person? Do you know any older person, especially the oldest person in the community? You might be able to do it. But without the geographical location, you won't be able to do very much. Almost impossible. Reverse genealogical case study. This research all started from a 19th century family Bible. I was given a presentation down in Alexandria, and a woman walked in and she attended my lecture. She was around my mother's age, which today she will be probably 82 or 83 years old. She sat there and listened to my lecture, and then she came up after my lecture and told me she would like to talk to me. And she told me she needed some help. She was clinging on to this this object, which I did not know whether it was a Bible, because it was wrapped in foil, and I think she had it inside a bag. And she said, I don't know my family. I don't know anything about my family beyond, I think, her grandmother. And I said, okay. And so we sat down and we had a conversation. And then she took out the Bible. The person that she owns the Bible today, but the person who gave her this Bible really gave it to her on her deathbed. It was her aunt who lived with her. And her aunt felt that she was probably, going to die. And so she told her, she says, it's up to you now to carry on the family history. And the person I'm talking about is, her name is Carolyn, Miss Carolyn, and Miss Carolyn never had any children, so she wasn't too sure how to, what to do. When her aunt died, she took time to open up the Bible, and she saw a surname she recognized. She knew that the person was related, and it was a marriage. Two people were getting married, and the person who attended the wedding was a Hodge. Miss Carolyn knew her mother her mother's maiden name was Hodge, and her grandmother's maiden name was Hodge. She knew they were related, but she did not know how. It was a 1969 wedding. I'm going to present, in order to research Miss Carolyn, I use a variety of records, and not all of them are going to be shown here, but these are some of the records that you might use when you need to do research of any type, whether it's reverse genealogy or whether you're doing from present to the past. In her case, she had a Bible. You're not going to always have one or need that, but you have it. It'd be very helpful, especially if they filled out the pages about family in there. Chances are we're all going to end up using censuses, vital statistics, maps, local history, court records, manumission papers, city directories, only if you live in the city. If your people come from a rural area, you will not have a city directory mentioning people names for certain periods of time. You might have a business directory that you can see what businesses are there, but usually city directories are done are done on individuals who live in the city. Cemetery research, church records. When you're talking about cemetery and church in the rural areas, that is a must. You must do cemetery and church records. Whole lot of information you can get from using those two institutions. Probate records and tax records. This is Miss Carolyn's aunt. Her aunt, she was a divorcee. In her last decade of life, she lived with Miss Carolyn and Miss Carolyn's husband. And she never talked about the family the whole time she was living with them, not until she thought her end of her life was coming, that she told Miss Carolyn about the Bible, but she didn't go into detail. She didn't say who the people were that were mentioned in there or anything like that. This is the Bible that she brought to my lecture. You can see that some of the areas are deteriorated. I did suggest to her she might want to get it restored. And this is what she brought to my lecture. In there, it mentioned Robert Gaines, and when he was, how old he was, and when they got married, and who he was marrying, which was Hannah Hodge. Hannah Hodge is related to Miss Carolyn. Also, what you don't see here, it was a witness, and that witness was Lucy Hodge. So keeping up with the names and knowing that this person was related to Mrs. Carolyn, I proceeded to start researching that person. Now you can see I didn't start in the 20th century. I'm starting in almost the middle of the 19th century. So that was the index that Ancestry had online about the marriage. At the time I was doing the research, Ancestry did not have that information. But for the purpose of this lecture, that's what I decided to show. What I did, I actually went to look at the marriage record. And I checked also the index that was published by genealogists. He actually abstracted a lot of the marriages, and I looked at it to make sure that I was able to capture all of the information that was available for this wedding. So Robert Gaines, colored, he was a shoemaker, 28 and single, claimed that he was born in Louisa County. His parents was Jacob and Martha. He married Hannah Hodge, single, Fairfax County is where she was born. Moses and Harriet were her parents, and they were married on November 11th, 1869. Now, I want to go back here, and I think I did say November, okay, but sometimes the dates don't coincide with each other. The witness to the marriage was Lucy Hodge. Now, pay close attention to the names. Jacob, his parents are Jacob and Martha. Her parents are Moses and Harriet, because you'll see this is considered primary source document. They are giving this information. They are telling the courthouse who their parents are. And if you get a discrepancy on another record, then you must think which one is considered primary source, who was given the information. If somebody else was given the information about them, then, and it was different from what they gave, you're going to lean towards what they said about themselves. Robert Gaines, this is 1870 census. So they were married exactly 1 year or less than a year after they got married. They got married in November, and then the census was taken the following year, 1870. So, so what happened is that this is the first time they appear as husband and wife on the U.S. Census. Robert is there, head of household. Hannah Hodge Gaines. It was just Hannah Gaines. I put Hodge there because I know what her maiden name was. Harriet Hodge was in the household. Later research would show she is Hannah's mother. Charles Hodge was living in the household. And Harriet, this is Harriet Hodge's brother, and Harriet Hodge's son and Hannah's brother. Later research showed that the husband to Mary Middleton Hodge, I was able to locate his marriage, and he married Mary Middleton Hodge, and the father to Bessie. Why I put this in here? This is important. This is where Miss Carolyn connects. Miss Carolyn's grandmother was Bessie Hodge, and Miss Carolyn did not know beyond Bessie who her relatives were. She never heard of anybody named Middleton, and she never, heard anybody named Gaines. And so this is where, by looking in the household, I only saw 1870 only had Robert Gaines, Hannah Gaines, Harriet Hodge, Charles Hodge. And 1870 doesn't tell you the relationship of each person in the household. It just has their name and then female, male, black or mulatto, white. They didn't tell you the relationship in the 1870. Further research, I was able to see who they were, and I could identify Bessie Hodge because I knew her maiden name, and that's as far back as Mrs. Carolyn could go back. So 1880 census, Robert Gaines is there. He's head of household. Hannah Gaines' wife, Jacob, they have 2 children by then. They had been married for 11 years. Jacob Gaines and Robert Gaines. So these are their 2 children. You can see that the Hodges are no longer in the household. They have moved out. So I go looking for them in the 1880 census. They are living in the neighborhood. Mary Hodge, head of household. Charles H. Hodge, her son. Hannah Hodge, daughter. And Bessie Hodge is a daughter of Mary Hodge and the grandmother to Mrs. Carolyn. Okay. And she was born in 1879. Okay, remember the Lucy that was a witness to the marriage that was listed in the Bible? I had to know how she connected to Miss Carolyn's Hodges. So I find her living in the Mount Vernon district, which is around near Mount Vernon Plantation, and they are in Fairfax County. And the head of household is a John Franklin, and Lucy Hodge is his sister, and Cornelia Hodge is a niece. That's Lucy's daughter. So then I go and I find her in the 1910 census, and she's a head of household. She's no longer in the household with her brother, and her daughter is no longer, seems that she's now a teacher at a private school. But in the neighborhood, and you always pay attention to the neighborhood and the people who live around each other, because long ago, relatives lived next door to each other, they lived with each other. And so you want to make sure, or in-laws living next door to each other, you want to make sure you have an understanding of the lay of the land. Who are these people living around my relatives? So I made a note of that. The neighbors were, they are neighbors of Mary Franklin Spriggs. Well, Franklin, could that be John Franklin and Lucy Hodge's sister? Further research. I go to the 1910, and here's Mary Franklin Spriggs, head of household. Got another surname to deal with, the Baltimores. And then it says Nanny Spriggs and Bessie Spriggs. Now you notice that Mary, the name Mary runs in this family, and Bessie run in this family. Mary, head of household, these are her grandchildren and her daughters living in household. She got a grandchild named Betsy, and she got a daughter named Betsy. Here is Bessie Hodge Simmons. This is Miss Carolyn's grandmother. And this is Florence Hodge Phillips McKinney. This is Miss Carolyn's mother. 1930 census, I find Bessie, Miss Carolyn's grandmother. She has gotten married, and her married name is Simmons. And this is her daughter, Lillie Simmons. She was the prior owner of the bowel that Mrs. Carolyn inherited. Then Mrs. Carolyn's mother, Florence, and then Mrs. Carolyn's sister, Courtney. And then she had two roomers that lived in the household. Now, Courtney was born, is much older than Miss Carolyn. Miss Carolyn was born about, I think, 1938 or 1939. Courtney was born in the 1920s. Another document I started to look at, I started to go through the court records. I needed to know the Spriggs, the Hodge, and how all of them kind of, are related to Franklin's and all of that. And so I said, maybe a court case been filed, and maybe they're in there somehow. And when I go into that, I see that a John A. Seaton, which is a big name in Alexandria among the African Americans and well respected by the white Americans, he was a council member early on in the 1870s. His brother built many of the older homes in Alexandria, George Seaton. So he was the alderman for an Alexandria. So that family did quite a bit. They were also freed African Americans. I believe they have some ties with George Washington. In here, you'll see Franklin. In this case, it had Franklin's and Spriggs, and there you go, Lucy Hodge again, and it's a Lucy Franklin. And then you have Cupid, a lot of surnames that make me want to know what their relationship is to Miss Carolyn. In one of the court cases, the Franklin family ends up in court fighting over the will of Nancy Garden. This is the first time I see that surname, but she also was referred to as Nancy Franklin, and then also referred to as Nancy Hodge. Here you can see that Nancy basically did her will, and Nancy explains almost everything. From just her will alone, I know how the Cupids are related. I know how the Franklin, the deer, then we got the Derek, and then we have Hodge. These are all of Lucy Franklin's children. Lucy married twice. Her She was emancipated as a emancipated before 1865. Her owner last name was Garden, and she in slavery she was married to a freed black named Robert Franklin. And so when she came out of slavery, they united, and some of her kids were already born. And so later on, she Robert dies, and she marries a Hodge. So Lucy Jane Hodge is the only child from Nancy's marriage. Okay, so now one thing I do know from this document is that Miss Carolyn is blood related to Lucy's father and not Lucy's mother. Okay, because Lucy has the Hodge come from her father's side of the family. And here, her mother is making sure in her will that Lucy gets the same inheritance than her siblings when she dies. So of course she dies, and now they fighting over what's left. Lucy Hodge she states here, Lucy Hodge is my child by a second marriage. That she's telling you the story. She's telling you the story of basically explaining about Lucy. This will was done in 1859. So clearly you see she was a freed woman of color, because the Civil War did not end until 1865. So the Spriggs are, Mary Spriggs is Nancy Franklin's daughter, Lucy Hodges' half sibling. So Mary Daniel Spriggs is Mary Franklin's husband, and these are her children: Nanny Spriggs, Lucy Spriggs, Neely Spriggs, and Bessie. Repeat of names, Lucy and Bessie. And of course, Mary, you'll see throughout this family. Here, prior to 1865, any free African American had to register their freedom with the courthouse. And so Nancy Franklin, knowing that she was a freed woman, and I went looking for whether she was registered, and she was. This gives you a physical description of what Nancy looks like. And Nancy was a dark mulatto at the time when she registered, and she was 50 years old, 5 feet 5.5 inches, or 5 1/4 inches tall. She had a mole on the right side of her nose. She was manumitted by John Garden at August the 5th, 1847. All of her children were born free. So they're telling you they were born after 1847. Because if your mother is a slave, you are a slave unless you get emancipated by the owner, you know. So anyway, so that shows that information there, and shows down here Benjamin, George, Mary, Phoebe, and Robert, and these are some of her children that she named. Okay, then it says then I go into the Alexandria City Directory, constantly making sure I don't leave any records untouched. I want to get a full understanding of this family and their relatives and who they are. So Alexandria is a city, so they have city directories. So then I'm looking at Alfred Derrick, who married one of the Franklin daughters, and he's a barber. That's his occupation. Robert Gaines, shoemaker. We knew that earlier. And where they lived in Alexandria. Where they lived in Alexandria. Charles Hodge, Miss Carolyn's great grandfather. And we know he lived on Alfred Street. And then we got Daniel Spriggs, who married Mary Franklin, the daughter of Nancy, and he's a driver. We get here, George Cubitt married one of the Franklin's daughters, and he is a barber, and he's working for Thomas Dulaney, who owned the barber shop, who's a freed African American prior to the Civil War. Alfred Dietrich, who also married one of the Franklin daughters, Robert Gaines. Again, this is all in the 1881 to 1882 city directory. Mrs. Carolyn's father was last name Phillips. And so I ran that through, and her mother, second marriage was to a Simmons, and that's Bessie here, and they were living on Columbus Street. So just basically going through and keeping up with the where they lived, and knowing the city. Now, Nanny Spriggs basically lived with her sister Mary. Nanny Spriggs is a daughter of Daniel and Mary Spriggs. They lived at 600 South Washington Street. The family passed this property down for another 3 generations after the death of Mary. It was owned by Nancy. That is hot property located right on Washington Street. And they owned that place for about 3 generations. Florence, in 1940 was a cook, and that's where she lived. Her Florence Matthew, he lived on 607 South Street. And when you see this, husband and wife, 2 different addresses, that tells you something. In this case, they did not live together. So if people never got a divorce, and you don't know whether they got a divorce, and you heard the family talk about they were divorced, and you find them both in the area, and you keep seeing different addresses, maybe they didn't get a divorce, but maybe they just separated and decided not to get a divorce. Also, this tells you that Bessie, Simmons, and Florence lived in the household with her mom. She was a cook, her mother was a maid. And also tells you that Lillie, the one who gave the Bible to Miss Carolyn, she also lived in the same house with her mother in 1940. Anytime your grown children are living with you, it was recorded they were renting from you. So where the mother was in the house, her children was listed in the same house, but they were listed as a R 607 South St. Asen. In this case, not 60 South, when we get to the daughter, R 715 Wicker Street, they were renting. That R stands for they were renting from the person who actually lived in the house or was leasing the house or owned the house. Alexandria, Virginia birth records. Vital statistics is a must. Vital statistics in most states. I haven't seen a state that did not put the information about the deceased person's parents, unless it was something before the 20th century. When a person dies, the death certificate is going to have the person who died, what time they died, what day they died, what the cause of death, and going to ask where did they die, when they're going to tell you where was it, in Alexandria, Washington, D.C. And then it's going to ask you about the parents. Many cases, some people don't know. They say unknown. But when they do know, they will state it. When they're guessing, they will state what they said. And so it's up to you to check out every piece of information that is on that death certificate. And the birth records, you might not get them as much because it's restrictions. Some states say it's 100 years. You can't get into that person was born 100 years ago. Some places will say 50 years ago. If they were born 50 years ago, you can get it. But 100 years usually is the rule. The birth certificate has to be 100 years old or more before anyone can get that birth certificate. If it's your parents, you can get their, in many cases, you can get their birth certificate because you're considered next to kin, a close kin. If it's your grandmother and your parents are still living, they can get their own mother's and father's um, birth certificate. So get them to do it while they're living. And that way you have that copy. Otherwise, you would have to wait until that actual person is 100 years old, dead or alive, 100 years old before you are able to get it. So get what you can while your parents are still living. They are entitled, and even if they're not living, if your parents have any siblings living, they can get their own siblings' death certificate and well as their birth certificate. Get it now because once they go, you're tied into the restrictions of that particular state, whether it's 50 years or 100 years. Luckily, Virginia has lowered theirs to 25 years for the death certificate, and only the close to kin, meaning that the mother, the father, the siblings, or the children of that deceased person can get it. No nieces, no nephews, no grandchildren. So you make sure you try to obtain that information. And so that's the way that is. And so you want to also make sure, like for instance, you keep up with the dates. You do a timeline. So we have like Earl Phillips is Miss Carolyn's um, um, brother, and then so I wanted to make sure that I have a list of all the children that was children and everything. So I have that information, and that is how I keep a list of all people who are born and who have died, and that way I'm able to see where there's any gaps of whether individuals had miscarriages or whatever. For instance, my grandmother had 24 children, I was told, 4 sets of twins. So that made me think, they should be counted too, even though they didn't live. They died when they were infants and stuff like that. So I proceeded to get a death certificate for each one of them. And excuse me for a minute, I'm on a conference call. So anyway, so what happened is that I proceeded to get a death certificate, all 24 of them. I got the death certificate for the ones who died, and then I got birth certificates, and the ones who are living, I got them to give me their birth certificates. And so that's something that you want to count. In this particular case, go back, Alexandria, Virginia death records, Hannah Gaines died. Her parents were Jacob. That's what's on her death certificate. That's when I told you back in the earlier slide, I said, make sure you pay attention to what they said about themselves. She's dead now. Somebody else is saying who her parents are, and they were incorrect. They said Jacob. It was Moses. Her husband's father was Jacob, not her father. So that's why you want to always compare, analyze every document, make a determination. Is this a primary source document, meaning that it was created by the person themselves? They were the ones who gave that information themselves? Or was it from somebody who was given that information about them, which is secondary source? And not everything on a death certificate is primary. Primary is the person died, the person died of this, the person died on that date, the funeral home, and where they were buried, unless somebody made a mistake on that. Everything at the person's name, even the age of the person, is considered secondary because the informant is given that information, and they might or might not know the person exactly, the exact you know, age, and they might not even know their parents. So everything else is considered secondary, and you need to look at other documents to make sure that you have the right. If they were married, the most what you can do is get their marriage license. That is information they said about themselves, and compare it to what is on their death certificate. and you know which is correct or not. Okay, this is basically what the death certificate looks like, and you're not going to be able to read it, but I wanted to put it in there, and I did an abstract of it next. This is what it says. Lucy J. Hodge, she died. And I just realized today yesterday when I was going over this, I said, my God, she died during the pandemic, the flu pandemic. I might write an article about her. She died during the flu pandemic, 1918. She was 73 years old. And she mentioned her father as her father was mentioned as Thomas Hodge and her mother. And that was correct. Both of her parents were born in Alexandria. Now, this information was given by Leon Baltimore. And you remember all those Baltimores there? But that was Mary Franklin Spriggs, and Daniel Spriggs' grandchildren that were in the household. That's what it said in the census. And here it says she is the aunt because he's the nephew. His mother was a Spriggs, and his mother was the Bessie who died. She had married, his mother had married a Baltimore. So his father was Frank Baltimore. His mother was Bessie Franklin Baltimore. And so that's the relationship to Lucy. Now, Thomas Hodge, still, if we were to go with the research, you would not know exactly who Thomas is to Miss Carolyn. And Thomas is the brother to Charles Hodge, Miss Carolyn's great grandfather. So we'll go here. Cemeteries, love cemeteries. Even though I get the death certificate and everything like that, I like to go out and hang out at the cemetery. And so to compare my paper trail to what I see at the cemetery. And cemeteries are very interesting. And I do a whole lecture on cemeteries. I do a whole lecture on churches. The cemeteries is like you're going to a family reunion, because sometimes people are buried, family members are buried close to each other, or some of them are buried in the same grave with each other. And it gives you an idea. It gives you more names to research, more family members to find out about. And it's very interesting. Like cemeteries can talk to you. Like you see there, and you see these people that you have researched, and now you're seeing their monuments. You can tell how affluent a person is by going to a cemetery. Some of them have, these huge headstones, and then some have no headstones and just have a funeral marker, and some have smaller headstones. And you can tell whether family members are still coming to visit that person, because you would especially go after a holiday like Memorial Day or Labor Day. You'll see flowers there, or you don't see flowers there. So you get a whole lot from a cemetery than just standing there and say, ooh, it's kind of eerie. Oh no, it's wealth of information there. So here you'll see Hannah Hodge, and she was here it was saying born around 1866. That is not correct. She was married in 1869. So you do your math, that's not correct, but that's what it was there. And so not only is the father information was incorrect, her birth year was incorrect. And then it goes on, and she's buried at Union Cemetery, and that's probably as far as her name and far as where she's buried, and when she was buried, that's probably the only correct information there, because like I said, and her mother's name and her mother's maiden name. So anyway, and but it's interesting. So headstones usually have mistakes in them. And the reason why they usually have mistakes is that you don't put a headstone on a person's grave until several months after they are gone. So the grave has settled. And by that time, people are forgetting. Sometimes they don't know where they put the death certificate. And so they're kind of making a little guesswork. And so just go with the idea that headstones usually have mistakes in them. And you need to look for a primary source document to confirm the information you get off a headstone. But if you have nothing else about your people, you don't have any oral history, you don't have any document, you don't know, but you know that if you've got family members in a cemetery, you go with what you have and then you prove it or disprove it. The tombstone of Nancy is here, and it mentioned Thomas Hodge on there, and it gives her death date. And by her being buried in a Methodist cemetery, it was only one Black Methodist church in Alexandria. And I went there and I asked to see their records, and I got special permission to do so with somebody watching me go through them. And there I cried because I saw Nancy as a member of the Methodist Church. So cemeteries give you clues, and they're right in front of your face and you don't even know it. Trinity United Methodist Church ended up being the African Americans left that church and started their own, which was Roberts United, Roberts Memorial United Methodist Church. And they started that church. They started a Black church in the 1830s, and they had a large number of freed African Americans that were freed before 1865 there. So I got to learn the history. And almost everything I do, I take time to learn the history of every institution, because the people that I'm researching, they were involved, so I need to know. Here is Miss Bessie Hodge. This is her death certificate. And it mentions her father, so it confirms the relationship to Lucy. This is Charlie Hodge, was mentioned on her death certificate. I was able to get Miss Carolyn to order this before they changed the requirement to 25 years for a death certificate. For anybody can get anybody's death certificate in Virginia now if it's 25 years or more old. But before that law was changed, I was doing this research, and I got Miss Carolyn to order this for me once I got the information for her. Now, the interesting thing is a mistake here, and it could be because of pronunciation. You know, Charlie Hodge was married to a Mary Middleton. If somebody who did not know, to go any further to prove this, because this part is considered secondary source. Even though it was given by Lillie, who left the Bible to Mrs. Carolyn, the point is that you still is considered secondary source. Yes, we know that Betty died. You can see that the handwriting is different in here. Okay, so you wonder why was this put in later, or whatever. You still want to check all the secondary information to make sure it's correct. And Mary was her mother, but the last name was spelled Middleton. And that can throw you off for years. I know, because I was trying to research my grandfather and they all called him Clave. It was no Clave in Halifax County. His last name was Scott. So I had to know really what his first name really was, because there was so many Scotts. When I did realize that, I found out that Clave was a nickname for Claiborne. So this can mess you, and took me a couple years on that. So this can mess you up. So that's why you just get in a habit. Anything secondary, you want to make sure by looking at primary documents that it is what it is. Here is when Florence, Miss Carolyn's mother, died. She had married a McKinney. And so, but here you see her daughter, Courtney. Courtney is her daughter. She did not know who Florence's father was, but she knew the grandmother, because the grandmother died 9 years before her mother died. So they knew the grandmother. In this case, they never knew, the father. 1880 census, Mary Middleton Hodge. Head of household, son, Charles, Hannah, daughter, and Bessie. Hannah Middleton, in 1870, head of household. She's 60. She has a daughter named Hannah. So you're looking at the name patterns. These names keep coming back and back and back. Daughter, age 36. Mary Middleton, Mrs. Carolyn's grandmother's mother. Daughter, age 18. And then they have other people living in their household. Isabella is a daughter and she's 17. And then they have a granddaughter in that household. Now, 1870 does not tell you the relationship of each individual. That I plugged in by using other censuses and birth and death information to be able to fill in all of that. The death dates of in Alexandria from 1869 to 1896, it showed that Bessie father, he died in 1879. Bessie was 6 months old. So there was no oral history there. Miss Carolyn never knew, from her grandmother, never knew anything beyond because she lost her father at a young age. And on top of that, her mother, Mary Middleton Hodge, died in 1893. Miss Bessie was 14 years old. So she didn't tell her children. She was old enough at 14 to probably talk about Mary, but definitely she was not old enough to talk about Charles, her father. So sometimes people do not talk, for, well, many reasons they do not talk about the past, especially among African Americans. Sometimes it's too painful. And sometimes because they don't know, because of loss of a relative, loss of a parent, and they don't know. Tie all your ends together. Miss Carolyn didn't have any, Miss Carolyn did not even know that she came from a long line of freed African Americans that were freed before 1865. She did not know beyond the Hodge name. She did not know she was related to Baltimore's, and Baltimore's are still living in Alexandria, and they did not know they were related to her either. She did not know anything about the Gaines. She just knew Hodge and what her name is, and she didn't know anything else. So Hannah Hodge, who married Robert Gaines, was the sister to Charlie Hodge. Charlie Hodge married Mary Middleton, the parents of Bessie Hodge. Charlie Hodge's parents was Harriet Taylor and Moses Hodge. Moses Hodge is the sibling of Lucy Jane Hodge's father, Thomas Hodge. Thomas Hodge was the second husband of Nancy Garden Franklin. Lucy Hodge was a witness at the wedding of Robert Gaines and Hannah Hodge. Carolyn Phillips McCrae, Florence Hodge Phillips McKinney, Bessie Hodge Simmons, Mary Middleton Hodge, Hannah Middleton Hodge. Miss Carolyn is the 5th generation Alexandrian with over 200 years of history in Alexandria and membership in the Methodist Church. Now she knows her history. Thank you.
Thank you, Char. We do have one question at the moment. I'm just going to remind the audience that if you would like to ask questions, please do so in the Q&A. You'll find the button at the bottom of your screen. But our first question is asking if you could please share the places you went to get these various forms of information, like the census and court cases, etc.
Okay. Well, the census, you can census Ancestry for that. Early on, I'm a paper person. So early on when I was doing this research, I actually went down to the Library of Virginia. And I could have gone to the National Archives because you have the census there. and I used the microfilm reel. But the reason why I went to the Library of Virginia, because I was not just restricted to using the census. I could use vital statistic records. I can use, a whole host of different types of records, court records. I can use deeds, taxes, all in one location. So physically, I live in Stafford, Virginia. So it's just easy for me to jump in my car to go to Richmond. So that's where I use those records. So when you're doing research, determine what you're going to be working on. And what you're working on is where you're going to go. So if you're going to, right now, it's different because when I was doing research, very little was online. Now you can use vital statistics online for the state of Virginia. You can use the census records online through Ancestry. You can use a whole host of records online, but still it's not a catch-all. Still, if you want to go and use, for instance, like the court case, I was able to go through the Library of Virginia to get the Chancery record case. But if you wanted to look at tax records, you're going to have to go to the Library of Virginia, or you might want to use the public library in Alexandria. Alexandria's public library has a lot of information on people who are in Alexandria, as well as books and other things on other counties. But their public library has a genealogy room, a Virginia room in Fairfax. But in Alexandria, you go to the Barrett, is the Barrett Library? You go to the library on Queen Street, and you can use a lot of things that are not online. So you have to make sure you understand what records are available and where you can go get them.
Thank you. Our next question asks that the church was one of the sources of your records. Do most churches have digital records that anyone can access, or do you need to physically visit the church and request to see their records?
Okay, that depends. Most of the churches, the older records, if they have not donated it to the archives, they physically have those records, and it's not digitized unless somebody raised the money to do so. Now, what I do know that the Mormons have been going out and been working on projects. So you might, if you can get it from the Family History Center, from the Latter-day Saints, then you're going to get it online. It's going to be on microfilm, and it might be already on Family Search or on Ancestry. Once you get your subscription of Ancestry, you want to go for your particular state and county that you're researching and see what type of records are online. And once you understand that, then if you don't see what you need, then you start finding out where you need to go to get them. Like, I do a lot of research in Alexandria, so I'm very comfortable with what I get in Alexandria, but I always go and check the original records, because sometimes when things are put online, they crop them and you don't know what they cropped out. Somebody's handwriting might have been on the side, making notation that this record is not correct or blah. I want to see that. So that's why once you get the digital, you want to also look at the original. As far as church records, a lot of them, if they have not gone to our archives, they are located in the church itself. And I know one church I got records from, it was locked up in their safe. The older records were locked up in the safe, but they got them out for me though. So.
We have no more open questions at this time, but I would like to remind the attendees, if you are interested in asking a question, you can do so through the question and answer. We are at the hour, so if you need to log off, we understand. We have some people who are just thanking you for the presentation, Char.
Oh, thank you. Okay.
Well, if we don't have any additional questions, we're going to end the webinar. Again, you can see the, oh, we do have one other question. How do you learn about the occupations?
Oh, okay. When you go into the census, especially after 1870, the 20th century does a better job. So if you got an ancestor you're tracing and you're doing reverse genealogy, chances are you'll have a good idea what their occupation is when you get to the 1900 census. If you're doing from the present and working your way back, you'll know that as soon as you look at the 1940 census, because one of the questions it asks of everyone in that household what their occupation, and you'll see that on the census. And I just want to get a shout out that the 1950 census will be out in the spring of 2021. So if you were born between 1940 and 1950, you'll be getting to see yourself for the very first time on the census in the 1950 census. And usually we go crazy. We genies go crazy when the census come out. And when the 1940 census came out, we brought the whole system down because there was so many of us on it. They crashed. So um, just to beware that the 1950 census is coming out in the spring of 2021. And I was told it's not indexed. So they're trying to muster up some volunteers to start working on indexing it, but it's not indexed.
Okay, we got a few more people thanking you for the presentation, but again, no more open questions at this time. I would like to remind all of our attendees that you can refer to the handout. The link is in the chat, and you should have also received that by email. This webinar is being recorded and it will be provided to you in a link once the video is finished processing, and it will be available on the library's website for viewing. So thank you again, Char, for this informative presentation. We really appreciate it. And for more information, you can always contact the Center for Local History at the Arlington Public Library.
Thank you.